this unit we will introduce the learners to popular fiction as genre fiction. There are many types of genre fiction such as thrillers, romance, fantasy, young adult etc. Moreover, we will delve into the subgenres in detail in order to have a wholesome perspective on genre fiction. Genre fiction. Genre fiction is the term for popular literature in book trades so as to fit books under certain labels and make it easier for people already acquainted with the label to find books of the same genre. This might be easily observed in bookshops where books are stacked under different labels. These fiction have more mainstream appeal. In the essay, Easy Writers, Arthur Crystal writes, such writers have a gift that is as mysterious to non-writers as plucking melodies out of thin air is to non-musicians. Plotting, inventing, creating characters, putting words in their mouths and quirks in their personalities, it all seems pretty astonishing to me. The prose may be uneven and the observations about life and society predictable, but if the story moves, we, almost involuntarily, move with it. Types of genre fiction. There are many types of genre fiction such as 1. Thriller. Thrillers deal with crimes, their detectives, criminals, and their motives. When done well, there is a sustained and gradually heightened sense of suspense and anxiety until you read the end of the book. Detective fiction, whodunit, aka mystery fiction. A novel in which a detective, police, private, amateur, or retired, works to solve a crime, often a murder. The reader is provided the clues along the way as well. Examples: Agatha Christie and Arthur Conan Doyle. Legal thriller. In a legal thriller, a large part of the action takes place in a courtroom and many of the main characters are lawyers. The legal system itself and justice are often elements or themes. Popular authors include John Grisham and Scott Turow. Political thrillers. A thriller set against the backdrop of a political power struggle. Some authors you include David Baldacci and Vince Flynn. Hard-boiled. The hard-boiled subgenre usually involves a detective who is down on her luck and an undesirable cast of characters. It usually takes place in an urban setting and the tone is unsentimental, cynical, and gritty. Some masters of the hard-boiled genre include Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. Spy fiction. For a novel to be considered spy fiction, some form of espionage must be present in the plot. This can include one spy or a whole agency of spies. Examples: John le Carré and Tom Clancy. Psychological suspense. A thriller that emphasizes the psychology of its characters and their unstable emotional states. There is a dissolving sense of reality, moral ambiguity, and complex and tortured relationships. Examples: Gillian Flynn and Paula Hawkins. The Edgar Award is presented by the Mystery Writers of America every year honoring the best mystery fiction. The 3 books to introduce a reader to the thriller genre are 1. Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. 2. The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson. 3. The Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carré. Romance. Romance fiction is one of the most popular fiction genres worldwide. But there is a stigma surrounding it. This stigma shames romance readers and writers, because society sees romance fiction as trashy. This creates small communities of romance readers that support each other while often hiding their love of the books. Despite its reputation, it is a billion-dollar industry. Romance is an intrinsically feminine genre, which creates a problem in misogynistic societies that are attempting to police women's bodies and minds. The struggle to implement feminism is not just a problem within the UK and USA, but it is also holding back the romance community from being acknowledged as a legitimate section of fiction readers. Romance is a genre that is valuable and legitimate, and also not what most people believe it to be. Perception of romance has been heavily skewed by a select few novels. There are very few academic studies that positively reflect romance. With only negative voices present, it cannot be conclusively said that romance has no value. By presenting the other side of the argument, new information can be added to the academic study of the fiction market. Romance is a genre in fiction that must contain two main components: a central love story, and an emotionally satisfying ending. In the US alone, romance is a billion-dollar industry. Within this genre, there are further subgenres: historical, erotica, etc. Contemporary romance must meet the basic qualifications of romance, while also being a reflection of the time period it is written in. Typically, contemporary romances include any romance set in the time period it is being written, within 50 years. All romance novels that were once contemporary but now considered historical provide insight into the state of romance throughout its history. Today's contemporary romance is focused on two things: bodily autonomy, and a push towards diversity. Early romance novels saw heterosexual white women defying social norms, overcoming personal struggles, and finding happiness. A theme that has continued today with much more diversity. Terms used to describe romance novels are often problematic and used to keep romance contained in a box. By calling a book an easy read, it implies that the readers of the genre are not intelligent. Porn implies that readers only read the novels for sexual reasons. To categorize every romance novel as an outlet for sexual frustration diminishes the genre and women. Finally, trash implies that the novels are bad, when the entire point of romance is to examine human relationships. The first novel considered a romance was Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, by Samuel Richardson. Published in 1740, it was the first novel to be written solely from the female point of view, and to feature a love story with a happily ever after. Writers such as Jane Austen and Charlotte Bronte published successful romance novels, but the genre did not take off as a mass-market industry until the 1930s, with the founding of Harlequin. It was the first company to change with the romance genre. Selling romance novels was about convenience for women, which was a business plan that allowed them to become a powerhouse in a multi-billion-dollar industry. Today, the romance audience is 82% female, with 92% reading print, 64% ebooks, and 35% audiobooks. Romance publishers have kept up every step of the way, allowing them to maintain 23% of the USA book market. Modern romance is thought to have begun in 1972, with the publication of The Flame and the Flower by Kathleen E. Wood Davis. This was the first romance novel to contain an explicit sex scene, which then launched a trend in romance that continues to this day. However, it also contained problematic content. This novel had many explicit rape scenes, as did its contemporaries, which was a huge problem from the elevated perspective of the 21st century. However, in 1972, women in the UK and the USA could not get a credit card, and marital rape was not considered a crime. Idealized and glamorized explicit rape as a plot device has since been eradicated from the genre, but as we can see with the current #MeToo movement, our society has not had the same revelation. The heroes in romance reflect the socio-political times. For example, with the economic crash of the early 2000s, romance saw a rise in billionaire heroes. Now, with feminism strengthening and the rise of #MeToo in the current political climate, the alpha male hero no longer works alongside the strong female heroine. Contemporary romance novels reflect the times they are written in, and these novels have drastically changed from the versions released in 1972. Romance, as a genre, has been ridiculed by larger society since its advent. Despite consistently being a best-selling genre and billion-dollar industry, romance still receives little to no respect. Author Penny Reid states that she has seen her books called trashy romance, fluffy, smut. In a 2019 article about upcoming novels, Cosmopolitan called a romance novel too well written to be considered romance. This insults the writers and readers of the genre. One of the most recent instances of romance shaming that renewed the debate had to do with author and politician Stacey Abrams. Abrams is a best-selling romance novelist. She went on the Stephen Colbert Show to discuss her political career. Instead, Colbert got out one of her novels, which Abrams politely admitted to writing. Abrams was clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was going, because Colbert's tone and the tone of the audience were ridiculing. Colbert then proceeded to read one of the sex scenes in her novel, to her obvious discomfort, and then laughed. Abrams was being shamed for being a successful author. Abrams is so much more than her romance career, and to out something she clearly prefers to keep private insults her and the genre. The debate about whether romance is a worthy genre goes back to its advent. Not just romance, but women's writing as a whole. Because romance is a female-dominated genre, it is seen as more lowbrow than almost any other genre. Despite being a female-dominated field, romance receives just as much backlash from women as it does from men. In 1856, George Eliot described women's writing as frothy, prosy, pious, and pedantic. However, there was another perspective as well, otherwise women's writing would not have survived. Virginia Woolf said, "The values of women differ very often from the values which have been made by the other sex. Yet it is the masculine values that prevail. This is an important book," the critic assumes, because it deals with war. This is an insignificant book because it deals with the feelings of women in a drawing room. Woolf correctly identified the main problem with romance. It deals with women's feelings. The differing opinions on romance's worthiness as a genre come from those who read it, and those who do not. Those within the community make convincing arguments for why it is worthy. However, most pieces written on romance in the past 20 years were not written by people who read the genre, and therefore do not offer a full perspective, or a positive one. Hannah Isley Burnett argues that the shame surrounding romance draws its readers together into a community. Isla Burnett's thoughts are that romance would sell even more incredibly if it was not so highly ridiculed by society as a whole. By building a community of romance readers, the shame associated with reading it loses power and disappears. The fact that readers continue to read the genre despite the shame placed upon them shows that the genre is interesting and worthy. Pamela Regis argues that romance is the most popular genre, but popularity does not equal acceptance. Critics characterize the genre from a few reviewed texts, which are gate-kept by men. Nora Roberts has written and published over 200 novels, but her books have only been reviewed by the New York Times twice, despite consistently being bestsellers. A reader's rejection is based on personal taste, whereas a critic's opinion is meant to be based on reasoning and sufficient evidence, and the majority clearly are not. The other main point of contention about romance is that the books follow a formula. This is true. A romance novel needs an emotionally satisfying ending, and it has to have a love story. Typically, the first sex scene will occur 60% of the way through the story, followed by a fallout between the hero and heroine, and then a reconciliation. However, how the characters get there varies in thousands of different ways. Krentz argues that crime, which is seen as a more literary genre, also follows a formula: there is a crime. There is someone trying to solve it, there is a conflict, the false suspect, and then the true criminal. Yet crime is not seen negatively, because it is a male-dominated genre. This shows that it is the women that are the issue, not the formula. 3. Action, adventure. An action-adventure novel requires dialogue and plot to be compelling. But they need to flow together in proportion. In an action-adventure story, characters may be placed in a relaxed, personal situation, such as having a drink at a bar. Perhaps characters have just met and one is a naturally curious person and begins to question the other. This is where dialogue needs to take preference. This doesn't mean the scene can't cut straight to action, but for a satisfying period, characters are allowed to open up and talk about things, such as their history, their goals for the mission, for example, perhaps even talking about issues they have regarding the events in the story. This not only lets the other character but lets the reader in on things in an implicit way. Backstory can be provided to the reader using a dialogue scene. Often an easy way to end the dialogue scene is to introduce an event that interrupts them, leaving some dialogue behind to be able to expand on later. Perhaps characters skimmed the surface, then were pulled away to action, then later on, in order to give readers a break, dialogues are brought back. Perhaps a companion wanted to know more about why the protagonist thinks they shouldn't be going on the mission or something. A novel with only action or only dialogue can get boring. A mixture of both, whether it's a dialogue scene, an action scene, or an action scene with intermittent dialogue to keep the characters in the scene. Action needs to be relevant just as much as dialogue needs to be when used in the story. 4. Science fiction. Science fiction is a genre of fictional works that depict such fantasy content about science as future technology, time or space travel, parallel universes, artificial intelligence, etc. According to Isaac Asimov, science fiction is like a social experiment, depicting fictional societies. He sees science as the great and unifying principle of the earth. While using science fiction as a special medium to popularize scientific knowledge while prompting people to consider the connection between human beings and various aspects of technology and history, and to consider the harmonious development of human beings and society as a whole. Science fiction is also a fictional genre. Its narrative is driven by events, technologies or societies that are impossible, unreal, or take place in the future, in the past or in a secondarily created world. The genre exhibits different characteristics depending on the reality, possibility, probability and the author's intention. The most essential difference between science fiction and other fantasy or horror, dystopian, works is that science fiction is based on rationality. The science brought about by reason is speculative. To a large extent it may be wrong, or even impossible, yet explainable from a materialist worldview. Science fiction may be pure illusion cloaked in pseudo-scientific falsehood, but it is plausible as long as the place where the story takes place is not magically created but actually exists. Science fiction is rooted in material and historical actualities, which differentiates it from fantasy or myth. It looks at a world that we have defined as normal and reorders it. Many of the material players are present, satisfying the need to feel recognizable, but details have been altered, pushing the narrative into a zone that is unfamiliar. As Suwin states, science fiction is broadly defined by the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition. Science fiction employs a form of synthetic thinking with the goal of illustrating a new reality. The abnormality of this new world is only comprehensible in its contrast to the reader's empirical reality. In this way, science fiction simultaneously relies on and challenges the existing social framework of society. Science fiction is neither utopian nor dystopian but rather an alternate space that activates qualities from both worlds. As a heuristic method to condition the reader to consider and accept new modes of thought. Science fiction is one way in which we grapple with the perceived distinction between art and science, and ultimately understand that they are inevitably intertwined. In terms of scientific advancements, Feyerabend laid the groundwork for an anarchist approach. The only principle that does not inhibit progress is anything goes. In his scientific philosophy, the multitude and diversity of theories, no matter how ridiculous, leads to better and more scientific discoveries. Science fiction are those theories well researched, constrained by history, aesthetically represented, and consumed by many. Science fiction is a critical theory, a soft science, a strategy, a technology, a method, a mirror, an art, a release. 5. Fantasy. It's the genre that started it all, and it has set the baseline for what people think of when they hear the term role-playing game. It's a literary genre of astonishing breadth that still seems to get people thinking about elves and wizards. Fantasy literature has existed for essentially all of human history. Myths of all stripes from many cultures have incorporated stories of amazing monsters and supernatural powers. One set of, relatively, recent myths have an outsized contribution to how we view fantasy literature in the 21st century: the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. In addition to informing our conceptions of fictional knights and kings, the Arthurian legends also have some responsibility for bringing forth elements of ancient Celtic mythology. There are other elements of medieval myth that are pulled forward, like the story of Saint George and the Dragon, which inform on a broad level how we view the fantastic, and it's worth noting that the prominence of these myths are correlated with the perceived viewpoint of fantasy as occurring in a medieval time period. Modern fantasy fiction directly feeds into fantasy role-playing through two primary vectors. First is pulp fantasy, more specifically what's called sword and sorcery. Sword and sorcery, through books written by Robert E. Howard, Jack Vance, Fritz Leiber, and others, was the fantasy fiction that first captivated gamers like Gary Gygax. The other vector is one so obvious that you have probably already noticed its omission, and that of course is the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien's Middle-earth was probably the most famous fantasy world in the, world around the time that Dungeons and Dragons was written. And it seemed like everyone wanted to cash in on association with the property. Gygax was less enthusiastic about Tolkien than others. But in writing a fantasy game there seemed to be an almost need to acknowledge Tolkien. So what makes a book fantasy? I think that there's a fairly simple definition. Fantasy takes place in a world of the supernatural, where magic or some magical analog exists. For the purposes of the story, this magic or other mythic force must be accessible to the characters, whether this is because magic is common or because magic is rare but the character is special is ultimately up to the story. A fantasy story doesn't require a setting of the past with no technology, nor does it require a number of fantasy races like elves or dwarves. Therefore, as much as Harry Potter and the Dresden Files are fantasy, so is Star Wars or Constantine. Neither high technology nor religious backstory exclude a work from the fantasy category so long as the characters are empowered by the supernatural world in which they live. Dungeon fantasy. This is the genre pioneered by Dungeons and Dragons. There are vast underground complexes filled with monsters, traps, and treasure, and you must delve deeper and deeper in search of riches. While D&D was inspired by sword and sorcery stories that involved escaping from underground prisons and pilfering tombs, there really isn't a direct literary analog to dungeon fantasy. Other than maybe tie-in novels to D&D worlds like the Forgotten Realms. Urban fantasy. Urban fantasy does typically take place in a city. But the title has been taken to mean a typically modern setting with some form of magic. Urban fantasy is often adjacent to horror because of themes of the supernatural being unknown or hidden. But in urban fantasy, the characters are typically empowered to use the magic or be the monsters, while also strongly horror in theme. Most World of Darkness books end up sitting in the urban fantasy space. Playing the vampire or the werewolf is often the antithesis of horror-style disempowerment. Even when you take the otherworldly compulsions associated with those monsters into effect. Dark fantasy. Dark fantasy is fantasy that sits adjacent to horror. And there are a few key elements which make a given game more dark fantasy than merely low fantasy or straight up horror. In dark fantasy, there are typically supernatural and magical forces which characters may have access to, but these power may come at a cost. In straight horror, such power would be beyond the character's comprehension or may be completely out of their reach, but dark fantasy does not aim to be disempowering at the same level. Similarly, dark fantasy is not low fantasy where magic is rare, rather magic is accessible and may even be indispensable, but it comes with severe costs. Twisted mutants like witches, compacts with otherworldly beings, and unavoidable magical corruption are all hallmarks of dark fantasy. High fantasy. High, in high fantasy generally refers to the amount of power given to your characters. High fantasy settings are those soaked with magic. And characters in those settings are often capable of doing superheroic feats, like picking up mountains or drop-kicking the sun. Science fantasy. As I said earlier, Star Wars is a fantasy work. No amount of spacecraft will change the fact that lifting things with your mind, telepathic projection, and swords made of lasers are hallmarks of fantasy, not science fiction. This is also where many genre mashups fall, like steampunk. While the debate about what's technically science fiction can rage on, somewhere other than here. Any setting which incorporates fantastic elements into an otherwise grounded setting can easily be considered science fantasy. This includes the Force in Star Wars, but also the return of magic in Shadowrun. A fantasy world should feel different than ours, even if it purportedly is our world. Horror, paranormal. A paranormal story is about a phenomenon that cannot be explained in world. It defies natural laws, probably logic and common sense, too. Borrowing a rule from the link. A story with an incidental paranormal element isn't a story about a paranormal element. The genre is horror, so inclusive of traditional ghost stories, elements which are left intentionally ambiguous. And stories that evoke the supernatural even if it is rationally or psychologically explained. The paranormal story can be a subplot or smaller section of a larger story. The question is about how to structure just the paranormal parts of the narrative, in practical terms, the way they might be plotted as story beats on a timeline. The two paranormal story structures. 1. Evidence of the paranormal. The phenomenon is incrementally introduced, allowing characters to discover, debate, and rationally reject each in turn. Circumstantial evidence and unreliable testimony build, creating conflict and division among the characters, or self-doubt in a single character. The inevitable climax is a confrontation or direct encounter with the paranormal, which resolves the conflict. Either the supernatural is confirmed as true. It is rationally explained through a plot twist, or ambiguity is preserved. 2. Descent and return, when the phenomenon is unambiguous. It's presented as a dark mirror or alternate reality to the normal world, with a threshold or barrier which can be circumvented, fails, or acts as a portal. The protagonist intentionally or accidentally descends into the paranormal world, which becomes stranger and more threatening the deeper they go. The conflict is about navigating back to the normal world, or the consequences of bringing back a compromised object or entity which should not exist in the normal world. 6. Speculative fiction. What do we mean by this odd subject, speculative fiction? If we're dealing with extrapolative fictions, expressly concerned with imagining alternate futures, presents and pasts. When does now begin and end? When we trace back to identify the points of origin of speculative fictions from the blending or breaching of science fiction and fantasy, to surrealism, to the Gothic. We trace or retrace the history as an argument. The period since 1980 is marking a clear boundary shift across different cultural fields because of historical, political and theoretical shifts. But of course this is misleading. As Catherine Marla Watson's contribution to this special issue of Alluvium illustrates, an apparent recent critical move towards the recognition of an aesthetic, such as Latin at futurism, may actually be decades behind the actual cultural producers because of all the forces of heteropatriarchy and whiteness ranged against not acknowledging or misrecognizing aesthetics which do not support them. The term speculative fiction is a usefully fuzzy term for designating a whole range of possible ways of making narrative. In part it seems imprecise because it moves away somewhat from the distinctions between science fiction and fantasy that defined the establishment of the study of science fiction. And there are times when the clarity and precision of separation are extremely useful. Or rather, the flexibility of the term can also enable a higher level grasp of what we are dealing with. Fictions which, above all, negate the present conditions of social expectation and the limitations of what can be expected to make sense. Speculative fiction, in its breadth, says that we can make sense of the stories of wildly unlike events which do not seem to bear direct relation to our present times and concerns, and that those meanings can be powerful, significant and valuable to us. Speculative fiction might convey the urgency of imagining better utopian worlds, or simply the need to imagine alternatives for a brief respite. An escape from the daily grind to win back that bit of energy it took that you know you'll need for dealing with what comes tomorrow. To that end, what is presented here is a range of approaches to conceiving of the social function of speculative fiction and diverse source texts to engage with. In her article, The Alternatives of Latin at Futurism, Catherine Marla Watson gives a virtuoso survey of the richness of Latino-Latina futurism. She details how the aesthetic and theoretical history of Latin at futurism draws together intersections with science fiction and the Gothic, while articulating its distinctness as a field and its sheer cultural breadth and diversity. Sebastian Dubinsky explores Jordan Kral's use of 9/11 as a setting for speculative fiction in Jordan Kral's Speculative Fiction. In this article, Dubinsky links Kral's engagement with post-9/11 America with various avant-garde and speculative pretexts, from William Burroughs and J.G. Ballard to Zamyatin and Bulgakov, examining the ways this distinctly politicized aesthetic of representation functions. This is followed by Martin Colebrook's article, Martin McInnes and Celtic SF, which examines McInnes' Celtic speculative fiction. Colebrook situates McInnes' text in light of his precursors in both the tartan noir subgenre and more broadly in Scottish fiction and science fiction, particularly the work of Ian Banks, Irwin Welsh and Alasdair Gray to formulate a clear set of confluences with this distinctly Scottish tradition. Finally, the special issue concludes with my own essay, Speculative Resistance in Lost Girls. Between these diverse contexts, what emerges is a sense of speculative fiction as an extension of political engagement and as a political engagement in itself. The links between speculative fictions and identity are clear, as are the ways in which the distancing effects afforded by fantastical and science fictional techniques provide an opportunity for forceful political ideas. What every speculative fiction has in common is its assertion, explicit or implicit, of its own self-definition. This imaginary world is worth sharing because it means something to me and it can mean something to you too. 7. Young adult. Just as there is no age at which a child instantly becomes an adolescent or an adolescent becomes an adult, the flow from children's lit to ya lit to adult lit doesn't divide itself neatly into specific age ranges. There's a difference, smaller now than in the past, between what is written for teens and what teens actually read. Historically, what might have been called literature for youth was fiction that was essentially an instruction manual intended to create well-mannered young people. Didactic tales of what happens to disobedient children, and the problem novel of decades past, essentially what adult writers thought teens should be reading. Fortunately, these days libraries and booksellers are classifying what teens want to read as ya fiction. Ya literature is similar to adult literature. Ya lit is a quickly growing field. The market has expanded by 25% in just over a decade. And publishers and authors are clearly aware there's money to be made here. There's even a recently published book about writing ya lit in the For Dummies series, attesting to the commercial growth of the ya sector of publishing. One notable trend is the success of book packages, such as Alloy Entertainment, that develop ideas for new series and then contract out the writing to authors, who work closely with editors to flesh out the stories, which are then sold to publishers. The books are designed to be commercial successes, and in 2008, 18 of the 29 titles that Alloy produced made the New York Times bestseller list for children's lit. Their series, which include The Gossip Girl, Lux, and Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants books, are often created with movie and television tie-ins in mind. Book packages are not new, nor are they unique to ya lit. They have been around since the Stratemeyer Syndicate churned out Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys books. And they create coffee table books and self-help series for grown-ups as well. While the ya titles created by packagers are certainly different beasts creatively than books that are conceived and crafted by individual authors, they sit side by side on shelves of libraries and bookstores, expanding the range of what's available to readers of ya lit, like books for grown-ups. Ya lit has stories that are written to be bestsellers, such as the Gossip Girl series or the Maximum Ride books, as well as more literary fiction with sophisticated tones, themes, motifs, and character sketches, such as M.T. Anderson's The Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing, Traitor to the Nation, and Tim Tharp's The Spectacular Now. In some ways, ya lit has become a lot like literature for grown-ups. It is both commercial and creative. It covers a spectrum of critical literary quality, and it has titles across many genres. Ya lit is different from adult lit. Ya lit is also different from fiction for grown-ups. There don't seem to be as many westerns. The romances are a little different. It's not hard to find more gentle mysteries, though unlike mysteries for grown-ups, ya mysteries are a lot less likely to include recipes for desserts. Less superficially, the tone of ya lit is often different. There's less retrospection, less melancholy and nostalgia. Often, though not always, ya lit is more story-focused. All of this, I think, reflects the differences in the minds and lives of teens compared to adults. One of the biggest differences in the landscape of YA-Lit is that there's more genre blending than in adult literature. It may be because teens' literary tastes are still developing, while adults are more likely to have very particular reading habits. But I think it's also because the newness of YA-Lit allows for innovation. For all the flack they get, the Twilight books are a great example of genre blending. They have vampires, but they're not horror stories. And the paranormal element is only one aspect of the story. Much of its appeal is in the romance of forbidden love. There's also an action element, featuring vampires versus werewolves, or good vampires versus evil vampires, or good vampires plus werewolves versus the vampire establishment. Anna Godbason's Lux series is set in 1899. But its focus isn't the events of the time so much as the intrigues and romances of the young elite. The first book begins with the funeral of the lovely, beloved Elizabeth Holland and then jumps back a few days so readers can follow how it all happened and discover the secrets she and her peers kept unexposed. Yes, it's historical fiction. But it's really a delicious, scandalous romance. Libba Bray's Gemma Doyle trilogy, which begins with A Great and Terrible Beauty, is another genre blender. 16-year-old Gemma, who has been raised in India, has a vision of her mother's mysterious death before it occurs. Gemma is forced to return to her father in Victorian England, who then ships her off to a boarding school. The girls there initially snub her, but as Gemma begins to discover and develop her powers, she gathers her own clique. Throughout all of this, Gemma is being observed by the beautiful, mysterious Karthik, who has followed her from India. Historical fiction, supernatural powers, a boarding school setting, and a romance all come together in a book that was selected by teens for YALSA's Teens Top 10 as well as by librarians for YALSA's Best Books for Young Adults. Even the Pretty Little Liars series isn't just about rich girls being catty. There is a lot of that, along with plenty of designer brand name dropping. But foremost on the protagonists' minds are the messages they have been receiving from a friend of theirs who went missing years ago, and presumably died. Figuring out who it is that knows all of their secrets before those secrets get spilled is the mysterious core around which the boyfriend stealing and backstabbing swirls. One characteristic of YA-Lit that differs from adult lit, and is so fundamental to the field that it drives what gets published, is the quick turnover in trends. Inspired by the success of the Twilight saga, lots of other paranormal romance stories have been published in the last few years. More recently, as the Hunger Games series has risen to popularity, we've been seeing more dystopian tales, though I think even that wave is starting to crest, and we'll soon see a new theme or archetype or proto-genre rise to take its place. The point is that currency is key. While there will always be fans of paranormal romance, a lot of teen readers tell me they're so over vampires, werewolves, and fallen angels. In the same way that youth culture is focused on what's new and trendy, so is YA-Lit. Which means librarians need to remain alert to new publications and read aggressively. It also helps YA-Lit create an environment that encourages innovation. Perhaps driven by the same desire to be where the money is being made, we're also seeing a lot of new series and trilogies. Series and trilogies certainly aren't new in YA-Lit, but they're a huge proportion of what my library has on its shelves and what my patrons are reading. As I write this, 7 of the top 10 titles on the New York Times bestseller list of children's chapter books are part of a series, and the New York Times also has a separate children's series list. Even debut authors often start out with the first book in a trilogy, as evidenced by Veronica Roth's Divergent. Currently number 8 on the New York Times list of best-selling chapter books for children. This prevalence of the series is a double-edged sword. If you like the first book, you know what to read next, but some of my teen patrons are starting to express a desire for a book that just ends, rather than leaving unanswered questions for the next installment. Although it's not as much a problem as it is with manga series, which may have several dozen volumes, if you are trying to start a year collection at your library. It's hard to decide if you should get all 13 books in the Gossip Girl series, plus the 4 additional novels in the spin-off series, or buy 17 other titles.